Hi, welcome back to the channel and my review for A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 4, The Dream Master. So finally getting back to this series of reviews. I did start these around Halloween time, this review series, so if you want to see my thoughts on the first three movies you can, but I have taken a bit of a break, and in that time I have actually upgraded this set to Blu-ray, as I finally got a Blu-ray player recently, so now I get to watch and review all of the really crappy sequels in beautiful HD technology, so happy days. Getting into the plot here, this one is the first movie to directly carry on from the events of the previous with the Dream Warriors. We pick up with the characters Kristen, Joey and Kincaid, and they have to fight for their lives once again against Freddy Krueger, who has found another way to resurrect himself, completely unexplained of course, as is classic with the Elm Street franchise. But he comes back to basically finish off the rest of these characters that he wasn't able to in the story of the Dream Warriors. So I've never been a huge fan of the Dream Master, certainly of the first four films. This has always been the lowest down for me. I've seen it a couple of times before, some years ago, and never really thought that much of it. But I think going into it with an open mind this time, I actually enjoyed it a lot more than I remember. I think when you love those first movies and you love the tone and the style of them, and especially it still being horror focused, this sequel is quite jarring given the change in tone. And obviously if you know a bit of history about this film, at the time in the late 80s there were all these writing strikes. So and they brought this kind of amateur director in at the time with Renny Harlin. He was young, he'd only done a couple of films, and he did The Dream Master. You can clearly see that they are trying to cover over the cracks, the inconsistencies and the issues with this very sort of visually pleasing, big, bombastic, over-the-top dream sequences, death scenes. They really up the gory horror, all of that kind of stuff. And, you know, overall the film, if you're one of those kind of people that looks at things quite critically and you'll notice plot holes and stupidity and stuff like that, I can understand why this sequel really annoys you. But for me personally, watching it again now with an open mind, I do think it is actually really entertaining and does have things to recommend about it. But as I say though, you have to be able to look over all of the issues there are with this sequel. So as I say, the dream sequences in particular are definitely the best thing about the film. They're very visually creative, they look interesting, there's lots going on, lots of colour, loads of new interesting ways for Freddy to pick off his victims, particularly with the opening characters, the first couple of death scenes in the car park that's now covered the earth. It's very cool visual effect, and also the waterbed scene. I always remember that scene for some reason, with Joey being taken out. And in terms of the gory sort of body horror stuff, you've got that amazing cockroach sequence of Debbie being turned into a cockroach after being crushed by the bench press. And yeah, it's a pretty amazing scene. It's gnarly, it's a bit sickening to watch, but it's definitely impressive. So it's all these kind of big scenes and effects work and stuff that do make the film fun to go through. It's definitely not boring. You know, the ultimate cinema sin, in my opinion, is to bore you. And this film definitely doesn't do that, in all fairness to it. In terms of the characters, I really do like Alice. I think that's a strong point of the film. I like the character arc for this character. And I also really like Lisa Wilcox, who plays her as well. She's kind of very cute. She's got a real softness to her. She's really likeable. You're kind of seeing her struggle as the start, fitting in, liking people and dealing with her friends, dealing with her father, who's an arsehole, stuff like that. You kind of warm to her quite quickly, and seeing her become a lot stronger by the end. Really nice character. I've forgotten how much I like following along with her. And whilst they don't go too in depth with many of the other characters here, they're definitely quite a charming and fun cast in their own right. They're quite big personalities and there's funny moments, and the dialogue and the chemistry between them all feels quite natural to me. It's definitely something I noticed on this rewatch, that I have fun going along with these characters. Obviously, one of the things this movie gets given a hard time for always is replacing Kristen with Tuesday Knight, of course from Patricia Arquette. I'm not entirely sure of the history of why that happened. It's probably a budget thing, given that Patricia Arquette, like during the late 80s, early 90s, she went on to much bigger things. Obviously, she's been remembered as a huge actress compared to Tuesday Knight. And, you know, it's quite jarring, that difference, I think. I don't think it's actually so much that Tuesday Knight is a terrible actor. I mean, the character in herself is quite likeable. She just doesn't feel like Kristen, the Kristen that was set up by Patricia in the previous film. Like, Patricia Arquette's version of the character was quite quiet and had a bit of mystery about her, and she has a very expressive face, so she tells a lot of story with her eyes and her expressions and stuff. You kind of know that it's quite a troubled character, and you get that just by little moments of dialogue with her, whereas Tuesday Knight's portrayal, she says it how it is, she's upfront, a bit more in your face and stuff, and I don't hate the performance. I think it's just, it doesn't feel like the same character, so I can imagine if people have left it a long time between watching these sequels, they'll probably come back to this and be like, who the hell is this? This completely other random girl we're following who knows Joey and Kincaid from the previous film. It is a little bit strange how they decided to do that. Another aspect I think the Dream Master really drops the ball on is the relationship dynamic between the teens and the parents. And I think in the previous entries it is done in a much more believable way where, you know, I think the Elm Street films do a really good job of kind of showing this portrayal of teenagers when they're going through certain problems, and it's not always easy to share them with your family, or rather that your family will not sympathise with the kind of things that are important and difficult to you at that stage in your life, and I think those movies capture it. Obviously the parents had their own troubles as well that made them difficult to deal with, but here it's almost cartoonishly over the top, to the point where it doesn't really feel like one of the strong elements of the film anymore. Like you get to see a little bit of this thing with Alice and her father. Again, I know there are relationships like that where the father kind of becomes quite abusive when the mother isn't in the house, all this kind of stuff. There's a little bit of that there, but particularly with Kristen's character with the mum, the dynamic between the two of them is just totally ridiculous. Like that whole scene where she's drugged her with the sleeping tablets, it's just a massive what the fuck moment. Like Kristen's just come home in the same day that two of her friends have been killed. She's obviously really struggling, and the mum is just like, no, your real problem is you're not getting enough sleep. It's like it's just kind of bizarre. It feels unnatural to me. And then she snuck sleeping tablets into her drink. Like, that whole scene to me is just completely ridiculous, really over the top. I do enjoy that scene where Kristen kind of really gives it back to her and tells her how it is before she ends up being killed off. But there's something about that scene that just feels unrealistic to me, and it doesn't capture that same dynamic we had in the previous films, which I do think is a really important part of the Elm Street franchise. If it wasn't already getting contrived by this point, in where the characters die to find new unique ways to have them taken out, this film takes it to another level. Like, the situations the kids are falling asleep in this film become so ridiculous that you can see them just trying their best to find convoluted ways to set up new death and dream sequences that we haven't seen before. But as I say at the start, you know, if you're one of those people that pays attention to the plot and doesn't like to see stupid elements that have been thrown in there just for the sake of doing that kind of stuff you will start to find really annoying. And watching this back to back with 5, that these are problems that are really highlighted in these two movies. The film also definitely suffers from having a pretty lackluster ending as well, I think. The fact that they did actually make an attempt here to bring a new idea into the franchise with this kind of power that the characters have to transfer each other's skills between each other when they are killed by Freddy. Kind of an interesting idea, but at the end of the day it has no relation to how Freddy is beaten. Like the whole thing at the end where he's killed by looking at his own reflection, I've never really understood that, especially when at the end of part 3 he's in a hall of mirrors and he's seemingly unaffected by it. I've never really understood that. Again, talking a number of times now about how many plot holes there are in this sequel, but I don't really understand why the new powers thing just isn't really relevant. It's a thing that's brought in, it's shown through this character of Alice. She acquires all of these skills from her friends that have been killed, but it means nothing in the end because that is not what kills Freddy. So I've never really understood that. And the last thing that goes with the whole point I made about it turning into a much more of a comedy film is, there's no tension with it. There's no horror. There's no scares. It's not that kind of movie. If you compare this to the original, it's such a different film, and obviously the original is much more up my street. Of course, Wes Craven was a far superior director as well, I think, to Renny Harlin, but you know, he did what he could with this film, and I do still think it is quite entertaining. But as a Nightmare on Elm Street horror film, it definitely fails. But watching this again with fresh eyes a few years on, kind of going into it open-minded, I actually had quite a good time with it. And I do still think up until this point, all of the movies so far are worth watching. So I am just about going to give it a 3 out of 5 rating, but only just. I've always had this as a 2.5, but I'm just made that stretch to a 3 because I had fun with it. But anyway, that's all my thoughts on The Dream Master. Please let me know down below what you think of this sequel and your other thoughts on the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. So thanks so much for watching. Do appreciate it as always. Take care, and I'll see you next time.